Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating shift that's happening right now, just beneath the surface of the global economy. We're talking about how carbon rules are completely rewiring global supply chains. If you've ever wondered how a localized policy can physically alter the route a massive cargo ship takes, or entirely change the way a factory halfway across the world operates, well, you're in the right place. Let's unpack the mechanics of how this giant logistical puzzle is being reassembled in real time.
So, ask yourself, can one single rule actually change global trade? I mean, we usually think of international trade as this massive, unmovable monolith, right? Millions of ships, thousands of ports, trillions of dollars moving based on decades of established relationships and physical infrastructure. It just seems way too big to be swayed by a single regulatory push. But as you'll see today, when a rule targets the absolute fundamental economics of manufacturing, the stakes are incredibly high. It sets off this inevitable chain reaction that literally no industry can afford to ignore. Section 1. The first domino falls. Understanding the catalyst.
Okay, to really understand this catalyst, we first need to wrap our heads around the core problem here, which is known as carbon leakage. Think about it like this. If a region tightens its climate policies and increases the cost of emitting carbon, businesses might just decide to pack up and relocate. They move their manufacturing to countries with looser rules just to avoid those new operational costs. So the factories move, the jobs move, and the emissions, well, they just happen somewhere else, which basically undermines the entire local climate policy. In energy-intensive sectors like cement or steel, where profit margins are notoriously tight, even a minor localized carbon tax is enough to trigger a massive migration of production.
And that is exactly where the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, comes into play. It's essentially the regulatory plug for that leak. Rather than just taxing domestic producers, a region with CBAM steps up and says, look, if you want to sell in our market, you have to pay a carbon price equivalent to what our own domestic producers pay. It completely levels the playing field right at the border. You can't just escape the cost by moving your factory abroad anymore. So this is our very first domino, the foundational policy that removes the loophole and forces the entire global market to react. Section 2. Mapping the chain reaction, how one policy tips the supply chain. Let's actually walk through this domino effect, step by step. Step 1. The importer pays the tax. Picture a buyer in a CBAM-regulated region who wants to import some steel. At the border, they're hit with a carbon fee based on exactly how that steel was made. Boom, their profit margins instantly shrink. Now, they aren't going to just absorb that extra cost, right? So we hit step 2. The manufacturer has to change their process. The importer calls up their supplier abroad and basically says, your steel is way too carbon heavy and it's making it too expensive for me to import. You need to lower your carbon footprint or I'm finding another supplier. Suddenly, the manufacturer has a massive financial incentive to upgrade their factory, switch to cleaner energy, or just become more efficient. But wait, it doesn't stop there. That brings us to step 3, the raw material supplier pivots. Because to make greener steel, that manufacturer needs greener inputs. They turn to their mining and raw material partners and demand lower carbon materials. The pressure literally cascades all the way down to the absolute bedrock of the supply chain. So here's the crucial question. When a buyer in a regulated market like Europe suddenly faces this fee, what does the manufacturer in Asia or South America or anywhere else actually do? Well, they adopt. They absolutely have to if they want to keep their clients. They invest in new technologies, they alter their sourcing, and they might even change their physical shipping routes just to remain competitive. A regulatory fee on one continent forces a very real physical operational reality check on another. Section 3. Rewiring global supply chains, from cost to carbon efficiency. You know, for decades, global trade routes were drawn with essentially a single pencil, pure cost optimization. Business leaders were laser-focused on finding the absolute cheapest labor, the cheapest raw materials, and the cheapest shipping routes. If it meant moving components back and forth across the Pacific 3 times just to save a few cents per unit, well, that's exactly what the supply chain looked like. But today we're entering a whole new era of dual mandate optimization. Now you have to optimize for cost and carbon efficiency. Under mechanisms like CBAM, carbon is no longer just this invisible externality. It is a hard, measurable line item on a balance sheet. A heavily polluting but cheap factory might suddenly become the most expensive option once those border adjustments are calculated.
I just want to pause on this number for a second. 1. It's absolutely crucial to emphasize the massive scale of what we're looking at here. It only takes one overarching carbon border mechanism in a major consumer market to trigger these worldwide adjustments. Think about that. You don't need every single country in the world to hold hands and agree on a universal global carbon tax. You just need one massive economic block to knock over this first domino, and the ripple effect reaches right into the local economies of every single country that wants to do business with them.
These cascading market impacts force sequential adaptation across the entire global supply chain. It's a highly interconnected ecosystem. First, you have the global importers feeling that immediate financial friction right at the border. But the pressure seamlessly transfers over to the international manufacturers, who really hold the bulk of the operational burden to innovate and change things up. And finally, the raw material providers, which is a massive slice of the global economy, must now actually prove the carbon provenance of their mined or grown goods. If just one sector changes its requirements, the whole shebang has to reformulate.
Section 4. The future of trade. What happens after the dominoes fall? So, what does this new reality actually look like on the ground? Well, first off, we're going to see cascading impacts on global trade routes. Ships might start taking shorter routes or sourcing from closer nations purely to shave off those transport emissions. Second, we'll see sequential shifts in manufacturing hubs. Countries that heavily invest in green energy grids, they will suddenly become highly attractive manufacturing destinations, simply because plugging a factory into clean power automatically lowers the product's final carbon score. All of this leads to a continuous global rewiring. Supply chains are going to become so much more dynamic, constantly recalculating the math between cheap labor and clean energy. It really is a fundamental evolution of how things are made and moved around the globe.
I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. As we've seen today, this isn't just some abstract theory. It's a mechanical domino effect that is already in motion. So how will your own industry, your business, or your local economy weather this supply chain rewiring? Will you be caught off guard by the changing math of global trade, or will you be perfectly positioned to take advantage of the new premium on carbon efficiency? The map is literally being redrawn as we speak. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the forces shaping our world.